Hi there, guys. I'm really sorry I was unable to update you all about the chapters of the book Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which I promised to do in March or June, I suppose, because it's completely about to be a year from the day I said. So I'm really sorry for that. And but now I'm gonna update you all or give you all the new chapters every week. I promise I'll try to do it. So this we'll start off with our first chapter of Harry Potter. That's The Boy Who Lived, and that's our first chapter. So before starting off with our chapter, I think you all wanted to, or you all should want, may want to see this map of Hogwarts. I mean, it's beautiful, right? You know, when your memories collect about the thing you saw in the film, whatever you have read in books, whatever you have heard. See, that's Hagrid's hut, the Whomping Willow, greenhouse. Yeah. So here we are. We are about to start our chapter one, The Boy Who Lived. Before starting the chapter, I want to tell you something that this chapter series of different chapters would be in two parts. First, we will read half part of the chapter, and then we'll read other half part of the chapter. Then we'll complete one part, because in this way the video won't be that much long, and you won't will not get tired, and even I won't get tired that much. And so today we are going to start part 1 of The Boy Who Lived, chapter 1, part 1. It's going to be a great journey, and I just want to say sorry if I mispronunciate any of the words. You can correct me them in the comment box below, and you can advise me whatever I can do to improve your reading experience or listening experience in this video, by telling me the suggestions in the comment box. So let's start. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Private Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was a thin blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good for nothing husband were as un-Dursleys as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never ever even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull grey Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled the screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on her cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley good-bye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke!" chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map? For a second Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head round to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive. but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner, up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading signs. The, that said private drive. No, looking at the signs, cat that read signs, that cats couldn't read map or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake, put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. He sat in the unusual traffic jam. He couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people around. People in clocks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups he saw in young people? He supposed this was some new stupid fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheels, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green clock. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dursley arrived in Running's car park, his mind back on drills. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the ninth floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls sweeping past in broad daylight, though the people down on the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as the owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls, shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he would stretch his legs and walk back across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He had forgotten all about the people in the clock until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy, and this lot were whispering excitedly too. He couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past, clutching a large doughnut in his bag, he caught a few words that they were saying. The Potters, that's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers, as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down, stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there would a lot of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He had never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley that she always gets so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in clocks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted as a tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet clock. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked down to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." and the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car, set off home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. That's all for today's video. Bye bye folks, and I hope you loved the video, and if you have got any suggestions for the video, these are welcomed in the comment section below. Just be a little bit polite, I suppose, because it was my completely first try. And bye.